Hi, my name's Ian Landy at Technolandy on Twitter, and I'm here representing MAD PD to talk about a little bit about some self-regulation and anxiety. Some of the work that I've been doing over the past few years as I help keep some of my students who would like to check out of class stay connected with classrooms throughout the entire learning day. So, just a little bit about me to begin with. I come from a family of educators. My father was a radical principal who got in trouble for bringing in things like computers next to the typing lab and putting microwaves inside of the foods rooms. It's led me to be a little bit disruptive in my own education, largely in part because I take a little bit of a different approach to my work with students and try to figure out if they're not connecting with school, why that might be. And I'm not afraid to turn over some of those rocks and look a little deeper to find out what might be some of those scary moments. And I say scary for a reason because there's a certain code word that many of us have used. Sometimes when I have chronic pain, when teachers I know have had bad knees, sometimes we use this nice little saying, fine, fine, fine. It'd be nice to say that things are going good, but usually it's more of a secret code to let us know things may not be as fine as we'd like them to be. And then it's all about identifying what that it might be all about. And it can get a little tricky. It can get very personal and it can get very embarrassing along the way. And of course, there's always connections. People would like to say, "Oh, I know that you're feeling depressed. I've been sad before. I know what this is like." And unfortunately, it's not. In my TED talk, I shared we wouldn't say to somebody with throat cancer, "Ooh, I had a sore throat once. I know what it feels like." It definitely goes deeper like that than that when we're talking about some of our mental connectivity. And in specific, I'm going to talk about anxiety because anxiety is one of the big words that we're talking about in education right now. Kids are more anxious than ever. Well, we're identifying anxiety a lot better than ever before. And I'll show one of my reasons for that in a little bit too. And there are some good reasons to be anxious in today's world. There's so much information coming at us and that's available to us. Our brains haven't really been designed to do that. We need to do a little bit of catch up and figure out ways for that regulation to occur so that we can be using our anxiety in a helpful way because anxiety does keep us safe in a lot of scary moments, but we don't want it to debilitate and make learning not able to be occurring. And as my son would say, uh, as he's starting his own disruptive education part, if we are getting kids ready for the future, where's the program on YouTube? I mean, because that's where a lot of people are starting to make some money that way. It's no longer just getting kids ready for a 1980s kind of world mindset where you're going to have one or two jobs and then be done. It is a world where our mindsets need to be more about the skills that we can bring to the program and using our brains in ways previously not done before. We used to need to have a common language, a common lexicon, a common way of sorting things, a common way of doing math. And now we're able to do much more personalization, which is great because I love going to Starbucks and personalizing up my cup of coffee like nobody else's. I don't want to have just the same brew every day. I like a little bit of variety in my life. And then it also proves that there are some self regulation devices that work for everybody and they don't work for everybody. As my son will always say when we're talking about slow yourself down, do some breathing, I am effing breathing, otherwise I'd be dead. It's a good perspective to keep in mind as well. Sometimes what our kids who are facing some of our mental challenges are going through makes sense to them, even especially if it doesn't always make sense to us. Oh, right. And then also talking about where schooling comes and plays its role. Um, there are importances within the school world and there's importances within home world. And that's something that we need to work on better as we connect between home and school. I've always told parents if they're seeing something at home, I might need to know about it because that's going to help us in the classroom and in the school work with the child. I cringe when I've heard people say, "Ooh, they're only anxious at home." That's great. We don't have to worry about it here at school. In my opinion, we do need to know that what the mix is between why the kids are falling asleep in our classroom and what's going on at home. And we need to be able to listen and pay attention and see what we can do to help with that. Because we do have a lot of sensory overloads going on. My son, for instance, came up with helped me come up with this one. When a dog barked on our way home, I asked him, "Ooh, your brain's probably processing a lot of scary things right now. How many? Like a dozen?" And he said, "No, not even close, Dad. Forget it. 100? Nope. Still don't get it, Dad. What, like 1,000?" And he paused and was able to say, Yeah, that's probably closer. So we came back and we created a visual to help people see when a question is asked in class or a dog is barked, how many images a student working through anxiety might be looking at any one moment, and understanding that each of those pictures are just as valid as any other. It's harder to tell whether or not you're just nervous or if the dog's actually going to eat your face off. It's hard to separate and differentiate what's different because, of course, we've got regular anxieties. Kinder separation is good. Grade 7 separation, a little bit trickier to deal with. And we need to see those worries as worries and anxiety as anxiety and work with them a little bit differently because it's very easy to get some of the helpful advice around the world. And I do like the cartoon imagery that shows, and it's not going to show up here, of course, showing that, what, have you ever tried not having the flu? Person in the wheelchair. It's like you're not even trying to walk. We wouldn't be saying those things. But when it's things that we can't see, when it deals with mental wellness, we'd rather write it off or think maybe it's just something else. Maybe it is the flu. Maybe it is just the worries. Maybe it's uh, that you're working through a fake out. Maybe it's depression. And it could be those. Or it could be autism. Or it could be a learning disability. Or it could be that that sense of separation is so scary it is actually debilitating. And it is what it is. And we can't always be distracted by that flipping iceberg, as I say. And I say that because quite often it's easier to get yourself into trouble because it's easier to get yourself out of that by tossing over a table because then we don't have to talk about why I didn't want to do a certain thing. And it's easier to focus on if I swear at the guy, they're going to focus on the swearing rather than what we first were going to go into the office to talk about. And that's because we do want to do identification in school, at home. We want to work with the person and not just the behaviors. We're going to recognize it's going to be uncomfortable. And we've got to recognize it's not quick. I like to say grade 4 identification for grade 10 to success. Because the boy with anxiety is able to take a little bit of a nap when it was time to have a root canal. So when things are working, things can work really good. But it doesn't mean they just go away. But we are hoping for a bit more happiness. And of course, anxiety sucks. But the biggest thing is we need to understand that those secret code words, the fine, 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 we can't be fine with just dealing with those. We do have to move above and beyond into what else might happen. We are seeing an intake in anxiety, and there's a lot of reasons for that. And people are going to say about different things. Some people like to say, ooh, it's because of the tablets. I kind of disagree with that. Some of the use of technology, sure. If all we're doing is we're consuming information, our brain likes to create. We can't just stick with any one format. It's very important to learn and present in a variety of different ways. It's why I come up with some of the key phrases. Because we do need to start with making some of those connections between home and school. So we can identify when it's a good time to take a break, when it's a good time to be creative, and when it's a good time to just consume some of the information. And that's where we get to some of the tools and rules that I like because when it works, it can work very well. One of my success stories this year has been a girl who her anxiety took her out of school 1 day a week last year. So she's missing, 20% of her education just because, well, not just because, but because of her anxiety. And this year she's been coming to school every day. And when she hasn't been able to come to school, she gets upset because even though she's sick, she'd rather be at school. So that's a nice positive change. And some of the key ones that we use in there are the zones of regulation, the Friends for Life program, and we focus on common language between the classroom and also common language throughout the school. That whole school approach is very important to understand that we're not just going to send kids home just because, that there has to be part of a plan in the works is essential. Otherwise, we're just going to have kids figuring, if I push the right button, I get to leave school. If I say the right things and get the right people upset at me, I don't have to deal with this. And not having to deal with it, well, that's when the anxiety wins. And we can't let the anxiety win. We do have to have that approach where we want keep kids at school no matter what. Even if it doesn't mean that they're necessarily in the classroom. And again, we'll get to that in a moment. It's that important part about, as I've said to a lot of my learners, is it a tool or a toy? A tool helps you with your learning. It helps you with your self-regulation. It helps you be a better you. It's a toy if it's distracting themselves, or if it's trying to distract me. There's a whole range of ways that toys can be useful and not so useful. And especially if kids are using one as a specific strategy. We can't just take something away, even if it's super annoying, just because. There has to be something replaced at the same time in order to give them an option, something different that they can use as that magical tool. Now, I've also had times where I've come up with students and checked in, tool or toy, and they said, using it as a toy, Mr. Landy. I go, well, they stopped me. Nope, I just had an argument with a friend. I need to take a break, but I need to distract myself right now. I need about 5 minutes on this, and by that time, I'll probably be back on my regular work. So gave them that chance, set my timer, came back in 5 minutes, and sure enough, they'd calmed down enough that they were able to get back to work. Because sometimes a toy can be a very useful self regulation device. And then we always get to that wacky world of, are we supporting our anxious learners or are we enabling them? And that comes down to that part about how we keep them at school and how we keep them engaged. It's very easy to blur the lines, and I'm guilty of that regularly, of being a champion to support them. But there are times that I do enable as well. And it's largely because when you can't tell if it's a fake out or if it's an actual panic attack, you got to make a call. And sometimes I'm going to make the wrong call. There have been times I felt a student was in the right position and I could push them a little bit, and I did, and it didn't go so well. And I was able to apologize after the fact and talk with them, and they agreed. Yeah, I get what you're trying to do, Mr. Landy. It didn't work. I said, okay, it didn't work this time, but we do understand. We are going to try this again later as well. And they were in agreement. They knew what I was doing. It wasn't a surprise. It wasn't unplanned. They get what we're trying to work with. We're trying to help them become better independent students. And unless they puked, and I've seen a puke, I'm not making the phone call home. I'm not going to enable that way. Although I do know that there are times where it's too tough to decide, are they really sick or is it anxiety? Sometimes you have to do the enabling piece and make a decision that lies maybe in anxiety's favor. This time, maybe not next time. And we do have to remember, it is organic. It is not behavioral. If it was behavioral, it'd be nice and easy. You'd be able to put together a nice little package together with a reward system, some stickers, and some prizes, and it'll change and get great. Typically, though, it looks behavioral, but it doesn't act behavioral. I always like to make the joke. If it makes sense and logical, then we're not dealing with mental wellness. It's when it's illogical and sometimes too hard to tell. That's when we get a little bit exciting. There's always reasons for the behavior, and we want to get a little deeper into that. And I mentioned earlier that anxiety that's nice and new isn't necessarily new. I always use the 120/60 example. When I went into grade 8, there was a cohort of 120 of us in my high school. Now, I'll also freely admit there were more than that many grade 7s who didn't quite make it into grade 8. But between grade 8 and grade 12, that number of 120 shrunk down to about 60 who actually graduated on this, crossing the stage. Why? Well, many different reasons, but a lot of them come down to not being able to cope and deal with certain things and having to be a little bit, having to make some tough choices along the way. And in some cases, that meant self medication. And I'm very happy to see a lot of my friends who are now able to say 10 years sober, 15 years sober. One of the worst things that we as a school, as a system, have done is malign people working through mental wellness and give them an out, giving them an encouragement, allowing them to drop out of school, check out of the world, and go to different places to get calm. Even if that calm isn't really calm, it's more chaotic, but it feels better than what they've been going through. We need to change that number from 120 to 60 and make it a 1-to-1. Once we enter our school system, we are going to graduate you because you're on your own learning journey. And if it takes an extra year, it takes an extra year. If it takes some project-based learning instead of worksheets, that's probably a better plan for everybody. But we've got to figure out some of those ways to keep those kids connected to more and more of the schools. Early interventions are always key. I like to say grade 4 identification. I like it when it happens even a little bit earlier. And that's where we sometimes have to get a little bit uncomfortable and trustworthy and share some stories between families and have families be comfortable sharing stories with us. I had anxiety as a kid. I always had that pit of the stomach sickness before going to kindergarten, and I always went to kindergarten. I had it quite often in grade 1. And the key thing is, that was 40 years ago, and I can still remember how that felt. The uncomfortableness, the queasiness, and I don't really think I have generalized anxiety or anything close to that. I was anxious. And I can still remember that. To have mental wellness issues such as generalized anxiety, where it's so debilitating, we have to be able to do more. Part of that comes to using some of the devices, about focusing on creativity and composing versus just consuming. I get nervous if kids, adults, anybody is only zoning in and either just reading information, watching a TV show, taking in information. There has to be that flip in the brain where we're switching, where we're doing things a little bit different, doing things a little bit better, so that we can engage the brain. Because when the brain is engaged, it gets distracted from some of those maladies and issues that we're working on, and instead we can focus forward and be very productive in the way our brain works. So, love the Calvin and Hobbes model, and I don't know if the screen's going to show. I didn't plan this out well enough. Nope. So we'll get that'll be on the PDF that'll be linked up to it. So some of my Landy rules. These are some of the rules I've used as a principal, as a teacher, in classrooms, working whole school. Not always easy, but this is a good place to get started. And the first one, the anxious learner has to be at school every day. And I'm talking anxiety, I'm talking all the mental wellness issues altogether. Every damn day, those kids need to be at the school. They need to be coming into the learning environment. They need to be able to make connections, have those relationships formed, be willing to take chances, be willing to have things go wrong, and learn that they're not going to die. Because when the picture of 1,000 pictures comes up, as real as anything else, this is going to lead to death. So we have to convince, model, and show that death is not always an option. We have to understand that being at school does not always mean being in the classroom. I'm okay with that. I've always been okay with the kids starting off in my office and doing a slow, gradual entry into the classroom, spending some time in the classroom, then going home for a little bit, but always coming to school. One of my boys I worked with recently, he was having a tough time in the first time in classroom, so we watched a little bit and realized he was struggling because his desk was at the back of the classroom. He had his preferential seating, and one of the problems that he was finding was the fact that everyone would come in and put up their coats and their bags right behind him, and it was disturbing him. What we found, nice and easy, he'd come in and play some Lego with me to start off the day. I'd talk about a few things, including reminders over how we behave at school, and giving some friendly reminders along the way. And by the time I walk him back to class, all his classmates will be back at their desks or up at the front getting ready for yoga, and his distraction and his frustration was dealt with. Because it's like things with anxiety. If you have an anxiety over spiders, easy. Don't have a pet spider. If you have anxiety about being in crowds, that's a little trickier, but try to avoid crowds. It's one reason why I don't go to the sun run. But some things you can't avoid, and those we need to help out with a little bit better. So being in the classroom doesn't even necessarily mean always doing the same work. I had a boy who'd roll around on the floor for a little bit while others were getting to work. He'd eventually come through it and deal with some of his angst and be willing to talk about a few things, and then we get him onto the regular playing field. But to get there, he needed to be comfortable being in the classroom. He had to feel comfortable that his classmates, the teachers, the other adults in the building and school weren't making fun of him, that we were there to help understand him. So once we got them into the school, we like getting them into the classroom. But again, being in the classroom doesn't necessarily mean that they're opening up the textbook. In fact, quite often, we're not opening up the textbook. We need to understand how we're going to be pushing them not in a negative way, but in order to help support them and scaffold some successes along the way. I have a behavioral expert who I love referring back to every once in a while, because when things are strictly behavioral, it's nice and easy. You dig a hole, you put something at the bottom, you grab the kid, you metaphorically throw them into the hole, and give them a reward for making that accomplishment of landing on that object. It's goofy, but that's what behavioral is. When we're talking with mental wellness, that's not going to work quite the same way. So we have to push them in different ways. And depending on how they react, I like to call it education judo. You don't always get confrontational with the students because that's exactly what they want. And a colleague of mine once said, never wrestle with a pig. You're only going to get muddy, and the pig likes it better than you. So you got to pick those fights a little bit better, and you have to be able to figure out some of those ways that are going to be successful. Because again, it's a fine line between that enabling and supporting anxiety. We want to be able to support the individual to find some successes. We want to help build some scaffolding. We want to give them some of the skills. Cognitive behavior therapy, that's one of the reasons why I like the Friends for Life program. Once they have those skills where they recognize them in themselves and in others, some of the ways that their facial and body features are reacting, then they get to put emotions with that. Once they have those emotions put with them, they can start coming up with a plan in order to gain success. It's not easy, and it takes time. But hey, if it was easy, everyone would be a teacher. there's always been a little foible. Are they gifted? Are they learning disabled? And surprisingly, kids with anxiety and mental illness, just like every other kid, except they're usually a little bit smarter than the average. Some of the studies that have looked with IQs, and I don't worry about IQ too much, but when they've been looking at some of the smartness, anxious learners, mental wellness kids are really smart. Quite often, and my son's been a guinea pig for this one, when you think they're not paying attention, they're taking in everything. And that especially works in with the autism brain as well. They are great absorbers. They've probably taken in more information than you wish to present. And my son did this many years ago while he was out of the classroom during French time, and asked one day of his teacher, "Hey, can I write this test that you guys are giving?" Well, sure. I mean, you weren't here, but whatever. He didn't ace it, but he certainly did better than a few other kids who were actually in the classroom. It's one of those key things where we have to shake off the notion that, ooh, only the kids who are paying attention and looking and staring me in the eye are getting the information. Sometimes it's the kids who are staring out the windows that are paying the most attention. And doing that in my classroom right now. Sometimes I'm calling on kids who are staring at me directly, asking what I just said, just to check if they're checking in. Sometimes they are, sometimes they're not. And that's not just because of anxiety, mental wellness, it's because of all the other challenges that quite often we're dealing with at school and around. And we have to understand that when the anxiety strikes, it is truly overwhelming, especially when it's generalized. I mean, the struggle is there's so many levels within anxiety. There can be separation anxiety, there can be grief and loss. There's some that we can know some specific strategies that we can do to help. Generalized anxiety, though, it's so general. It'll strike at different times. The strategies you use will be successful one time and not later. So you can't just rely on a single toolkit in order to be successful. You have to get a little creative and be willing to make some mistakes. And unfortunately, if you're thinking, oh, there's a script of 10 things I'm going to do and one of them is going to be successful, that script might have to be about 15 long or 20. There is no one. If there was one set list, the book I've been thinking about for dealing with this would be out by now. Instead, it's more like an onion, and I'm uncovering more and more layers, and my tears are getting a little waterier and waterier. But I will insist, anything time you're talking about, ooh, we'll just send them to a counselor, or quite often, we'll send them to another school. They need to be connected to the school, and they need to have connections with some form of cognitive behavior therapy, either through a therapist or at least the Friends for Life program. It's as important as the medication. There are key things that we need to do that involve dealing with other people. And as I just said, sometimes meds are needed, and I'm not happy that my son in particular is on them, but it's not about me. I'd certainly prefer that more kids weren't, but sometimes it does make a difference. And I can have foibles, parents can have foibles and worries about it till cows come home. And we have to be aware that there are side effects. I had a parent who started her child on medication recently, in part because I promised, pinky, cross my fingers, that anything I saw at school, I'd be sharing back at home as well. Because there is going to be a change in appetite. There are going to be changes with sleep. They'll get better over time, but for the first while, it makes you wonder, is it really even worth it to be using any sort of medications? And of course, it does become worthwhile after week 6. And one of the biggest struggles is with medication is week 6. And I've said this in the past as principal and as a teacher, with parents saying, "Yeah, my kid's on medication," and I've always said, "Okay, this is what I've heard. By about week 5, you're going to want to quit on it. Don't. You got to go through the whole time. Don't make changes without consulting the doctor. The doctor is the key one to be dealing with. We don't want kids to be self-medicating. We definitely don't want teenagers to be self-medicating, because certain non-prescription drugs, the side effects, like for marijuana, are paranoia. Paranoia and anxiety, that's a deadly combination. We have to be aware of that. Taking breaks from medication, unless the doctor is fully on board, that's another area that can be a little more than a little scary. It can devalue all the work you've previously done. And week 6 sucks. And I say that as a parent as much as an educator. I've had parents stop after week 5 and week 6 because it's tough. And when my son was first on it, I was getting frustrated. And I looked at the calendar and went, oh, week 6, everything I said, it's kind of true. You want to quit on it at that point, and then you start seeing the differences. Because, of course, we're not always seeing it because we're living with it every day. And just like the kids growing, we don't always see them growing either. But when you see your niece and nephew and go, wow, you got big, you're not realizing that your own kids kind of got big as well. Same thing with medication. It makes a difference, and sometimes you don't recognize it. In fact, my son's advice to the boy in my class right now was his sharing. You're not even going to notice that it's working until the days you miss it, and when you miss it, then you're going to realize what a difference it actually makes in your day in life. And that to me was a huge, big aha moment. And that's been one of the key things right now because as we get into self soothing strategies, there are a million out there. Some are going to gross you out, some are going to work, and some don't work. Some people like Chulery, some advise against Chulery. That's where you get the have the plastic things in your mouth and chew away on them. It can be gross, but it can also be very effective. Some kids like the fidgets, some don't. And of course, anytime something new comes in, like the fidget spinners last year, everyone's going to want one, everyone's going to try it, and everyone's going to want to ban them from the school grounds. Give patience, take time, allow those soothing devices to come in. If they're just a fad, they're going to fade away quickly. The ones that aren't a fad, they're the ones that are going to stick and authentically help the kids along their way. I've done that with my own son. Pokemon cards have been banned from many schools, not mine, because I know with Pokemon and my son early on and even currently, if we're going to a place that's not liked, if I start asking him questions about it or Dragon Ball or something else, it helps distract his brain and calm him down to the point where he's able to distract his brain and get back on track. It's a self soothing technique that we can be tricky with, and it's not even tricky. The kids know it works, and that's why they go back to it. That's what can make it very amazing. And of course, transitions, anything new sucks. That's you just got to be ready for that. If you got that anxiety world, that's where those visual calendars are up. I have one on my computer screen that's always up on our projector, and I've got one on the whiteboard as well that never goes away as well. Making making kids aware of what the transitions are when they are, and if there's a change in the day, as there sometimes is, articulate it. It also helps the kids see that here's our plan for the day, but oops, didn't realize that we were going to have a fire alarm, so that's kind of messed up everything. But don't just make the changes, verbalize the changes, talk about why things are moving around from block to block. It helps the students then visualize how all those different visions they can see in that picture of 1,000 pictures, how they can start sorting what's likely, what's realistic, and what isn't. And sometimes it takes more time, but to have a brain that can process 1,000 images at once, it's amazingly powerful. But we have to give that time and that patience for the kids to be able to sort through, and we have to model it. So being able to model even here's what I thought was going to happen, and here's the change, and here's why, can help the students when changes occur in their own personal lives. And I think I had one more. Oh, right, and the staying calm part. It's easy to say calm down. It's easy to say, hey, just take a breath. It's not always easy to get there. Time is one of the most important allies we have with anxiety and any sort of mental wellness, and we need to take better advantage of that. Giving those kids that time to soothe, and when they're getting higher strung, we need to be even calmer as we get ready for moving on in independence. And my last bit of advice is that both outsiders and family members can be very critical, and they'll always have better advice than what you could have done and should have done and maybe could have. We have to be patient, and when patience strikes, it can be a wonderful experience. When my mom took the kids out for lunch one day and they went to a Jack in the Box, my son has not been to Jack in the Box before, and as my stepdad would say, what's the big difference? It's the same thing as every other restaurant. My mom, after lots of talk and lots of learning, she was looking at the situation and went, Eric, what if we went to the Burger King across the street? He went, yeah, sure. So we kind of relented. It was not a familiar place. The transition was not working well. She gave him an out, going across the parking lot, something that was a bit more familiar. She had learned there are sometimes some slight alterations that we can make that help de-stress a situation. And when we're able to de-stress a situation, we're able to get in some successes along the way. Working with students with anxiety and any sort of mental wellness is not an easy challenge. But I'll say it, I said it before and I'll say it lots of times. If education was an easy profession, many more people would be signing up and sticking with it throughout their entire career. It is a challenge. We're seeing more and more anxiety because there's more and more anxious learners being connected with schools. I talked about the 120 that entered grade 8 and 60 that graduated with me. Well, like I say, there was about another 20 or 30 that didn't make it to grade 8. We're not allowing that to occur anymore. So we're seeing more of it because they're sticking around in schools. And that's essential because when students have that connection to an education environment that allows them to make mistakes and supports them into being successful, that was what leads them into the path of graduation. It isn't easy. There is no one blueprint, but the more we can share through opportunities like this, the better and stronger that we are able to get. And that ends what I'm doing. I'm just going to check if there are any questions coming through. I'm not seeing any directly, so please feel free to direct message me on Twitter at Technolandy, and I thank you.